Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this quite promising webinar on migrants' rights in a COVID-19 situation. We have a very large audience with us this afternoon. We are waiting for more than 200 participants, which shows the importance that you attach to the subject matter that we are going to discuss with a very distinguished speaker, and I will introduce them later on during the webinar. Just a few elements of technical guidance. Those of you who want to ask questions can do it in two different ways. Either you go to the dashboard and you see a little hand. You click on the hand. That means that you would like to ask your question and to put your question orally. So when the question time will come, your microphone will be unmuted and you will be able to address directly your question to all the panelists or some of them. Either you prefer to use the written way, then you have a little box with questions, and you can draft there the question that you would like the moderator to put to the panelist. As a moderator of this event, I would insist on you drafting the question, as short as possible questions, because it's very difficult to read long questions and to grasp exactly the meaning of the author if the question is too long. So we count on you to help us to make this conversation as lively and as rich as possible. Thousands of papers, articles, books of all kinds are being published about the times we are living for this nowadays. These famous pandemics, COVID-19. Amongst the many things that are said, I draw myself two very basic assumptions. First one is that COVID-19 is not at the origin of a tsunami of new challenges. It simply exacerbates existing flows of our way of living, whether it is structural inequalities, disinvestment in public services, and so on and so forth. Second assumption, there is no such thing as solid forecast. Only possible scenarios can be elaborated, and only time will tell which were the relevant ones. These assumptions do apply to migration and mobility. Migrants are per se vulnerable, whether they are actually on the move or not, by the way. Why? Because they are not part of the social contract of the community they live in. And their vulnerability is exacerbated in time of crisis. This is valid across the board, whether we refer to people in need of protection or other types of migrants. And yet, existing policy framework at global level, the Global Compact on Migration, or at European level, the EU migration agenda, are mouthful about a rights-based approach on migration. If you are interested by this kind of issue, I would recommend all of you the reading of the latest quarterly report of the Fundamental Rights Agency on key fundamental concerns with regard to migrant. You can see that they dedicate a section to the impact of COVID-19 measures, and this section reflects developments in all countries in the jurisdiction of the Fundamental Rights Agency. They highlight a series of key concerns, for instance, in border regions and at the border, but also they highlight a series of very positive initiatives which are taken by public authorities or civil society organizations. So the question is, what are the likely scenarios? Are we going to have soon a kind of full-blown xenophobia as we witness nowadays in Latin American countries? Or on the contrary, at the exact opposite, the contributions highlighted by many of migrants to, these essential activities which are deemed as essentials, in particular in the health services, will these contributions be taken into account to move towards a new narrative with regard to migration? Or are we in between the two, somewhere in between the two? That is exactly what we would like to discuss with our panelists this afternoon. As I said earlier, we are very grateful to them to having joined us in this discussion. I would first give the floor to Maria-Reine. Maria-Reine is a distinguished member of the European Parliament, and she is in particular the chair of the Subcommittee of Human Rights on the European Parliament. This subcommittee is a restless advocate for human rights. In all fairness, Madame Maria-Reine, when preparing this webinar, I went to the activities of your subcommittee, and I was really baffled by the number of intervention, hearing, releases, statements that either yourself or your committee are taken on, human rights related situations. So to have you with us as a guest speaker and opening this debate this afternoon is really a very privileged moment. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jean-Louis, for your introduction, and thank you for organizing this meeting. It is really important to speak about human rights during this pandemic situation, because as you have said, the coronavirus is not something that creates inequalities or creates non-human rights respect. It does accelerate system and vulnerability, not only for migrant people, but for all vulnerable people and for all vulnerable system that we can face all over the world. So it is really important to talk about this vulnerability that we have in our democracy and in the rest of democracy all around the world. And what we have seen and what we see for the moment in the United States when it comes to racism against African-American people, it is something that we can see in other countries also. We have spoken about India, for example, but we can speak about a lot of countries where you have displaced people, where you have vulnerable people, and where, as European, we have to make work on this because we are partners of these countries. So it is really important to share the value of human rights for all these people. So I wanted to say and to acknowledge the fact that before the coronavirus, the situation of migration in Europe was in diplomatic language not appropriate, and in a non-diplomatic language, I should say shameful policy in Europe when it comes to migration. So the last 10 years, we didn't succeed in changing the narrative about migration issue or mobility issues. And a lot of political parties, and not only the extreme right wing of these political parties, but a lot of conservative parties wanted to share the fact that migration is a threat. It is a threat for the cultural situation of Europe. It is a threat for the cultural situation in countries. And we have seen the situation in Hungary, we have seen the situation in Poland, we have seen the situation in other countries where extreme right, but not only extreme right, won the election. In some countries, it was the fact in Italy, for example. They changed it, the government, but it was the extreme right of Salvini who won the election just on making this migration issue not a solution, but making a problem and a threat for the population. And this was the situation before the COVID. And unfortunately, after and during the COVID, the situation is worsening. And it's worsening because of what we have said, Jean-Louis, because we are dealing with vulnerable people when they are in camp. And we have this migration camp in Europe, in the Greek island, for example. but we also have migration camp outside the border of Europe, just next Europe, in Turkey or in other countries, in Libya, for example. And so these vulnerable people, they are more vulnerable during the COVID. And some people are using them as being more a threat, because now not only they are migrant, but they can be contaminated and they can contaminate the rest of Europe. It is totally wrong, but they are using this argument for the moment. So this is the first reason. The second, they are more vulnerable because there is a disproportionate impact of COVID on these people, even when they are in Europe. For example, if you are a refugee without being legal status, without having legal status in Europe, you don't have access to medical treatment. So it is a problem also for these people. And you said they are not covered by the social system in the country, so they are more vulnerable in this way. They have, when they are outside Europe, they have no access to sanitation means also, so they are also in trouble there. And most of that, we have less control on this because we have a lot of NGOs not being there. So we don't receive information coming from these people being in these difficult situations. So we need to help NGOs continuing their work in this place to have and to give us more information about human rights for them. And they also have less means because they are no more the priorities. And we have a lot of NGOs, they have to work in others' priorities. So it is really a problem for these people. We also have a rising of displaced people coming from the urban situation going to the rural one and not being accepted in the rural one. We are in this situation in India, for example. In the continuing conflict in Yemen, for example, where the ceasefire is not respected in some countries. So all this is making the situation worse and worse. So what are the challenges for us as Europeans in this? First, I must say that we must change the migration narrative in EU. And it is our job to do so. We didn't succeed before the COVID. We have to succeed after the COVID. If we are not doing it, it is the scenario that you mentioned, is having in Europe a more illiberal democracy that we will have in Europe if we are not dealing with this issue. So for me, it's the main and the most important issue is to change the narrative. COVID has shown that the threat is not the migration. The threat is a virus. And it is more difficult to deal with this virus than to deal with migration. It is in our capacity to manage the migration issue. And so I think that we have to say that very loudly. The second one is the human rights is the most important issue, and the COVID-19 situation we must help people where they are, whatever the status they have. So, or they are legal or not having this status, we have to give a humanitarian approach for these people in Europe and outside Europe also. The third one is in the long run, we have to acknowledge the fact that our security-based approach for migration has failed, totally failed. So we have to change the policy on migration because this policy has failed. We can say that, for example, it's not, I don't share this policy because I'm not coming from this way of thinking. But if this policy that I don't share prove that it is a way of coping with migration, having less migration in Europe, I don't know. We can say, okay, I don't share, but it works. It doesn't work. So we have to change this policy. So I will have very, very rapidly 7 recommendations on how to work on this. First, working on a more holistic approach. more coherence on our politics. For example, when it comes to security, for example, we are working on the Sahel security policy. We have to deal with the migration issue when we work on the security on Sahel. So the coherence of the politic is really important. We have to have this coherent policy not only when it comes to security, but also when it comes to trade relationship with the countries. It is important to have trade policies to help the production in the countries. So it is important to give jobs to the countries where migration is a problem, where young people are leaving these countries. It is also important to have this environmental issue when it comes to the policy that we want to have with these countries, and to take into account the mobility inside, for example, the African continent, because the mobility that they have is for 90% inside the continent, not coming from to Europe. So helping this mobility also with different countries. The second recommendation is we have to stop the criminalization of NGOs when it comes to migration issue. The criminal are not the NGOs, or they are the smugglers, or sometimes they are the states, but they are not the NGOs. So we have to stop this criminalization of NGOs in this answer. The third recommendation is the Snr Search-and-Rescue Policy. We have to go back to the search and rescue policy. We have to put means not to make people dying in the Mediterranean zone. And the money that we give to Frontex is to protect our borders. It is not the way we have to deal with this issue. So making and giving more opportunities to save people. The fourth is we must give more support to NGOs being in refugee camps and to provide services for refugees and displaced people during these periods, because people are dying in camps for the moment. So we have to give more money for that. Fifth is give a statute to asylum seekers in Europe. And I take the example of Portugal. We have to give the opportunity to people to have access to medical health, help, but not only to medical help, but also to social protection also. The sixth is for the international displaced people to try to have this ceasefire that United Nations asked for, but also to have humanitarian aid in these regions, just like Syria. And last but not least is we have the discussion for the moment on the MFF, so the multi-annual framework, and also on the NDCI is the external policy budget. We have to put in these two, MFF and NDCI, the question and the issue of migration and mobility, because I just like to add that migration and mobility is, I prefer speaking about mobility because it's a positive way of saying that we need to have this mobility. And so, for example, I've heard that during the COVID, a lot of my counterparts, members of the MEPs, they said, we have to have our border open for trades. And I said, oh, and you don't care about migration and mobility. You want to have resources coming from these countries, but you have to block these people coming from these countries. So if we open borders, we have to open borders for people and for resources. And so it is a deal that we have to have with these countries. And during the EU-African strategy that we are dealing for the moment, we have to put it and help African countries to work on this also for the future. These are the recommendations that I will formulate in the Human Rights Committee also when it comes to migration. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much for having shared this insight with us. I mean, these policy recommendations, I mean, they were listened to very carefully, I assume, by our next speaker. Henrik Nielsen is the head of the Asylum Unit of the European Commission, Director General for Home Affairs. Henrik is present with us, but unfortunately, we cannot see him because of a technical problem. But Henrik is there, and I will pass him the floor. I mean, the Commission is in a very difficult position. It is a bit between a rock and a hard place. It is supposed to be the engine behind the development of the EU migration agenda. And of course, everybody is looking at the forthcoming new pact on migration and asylum. But at the same time, it is constantly confronted with member states which are reluctant, which do not agree between themselves, which are very jealous of their prerogatives. At the end, very often, the Commission becomes the scapegoat. And one can see a lot of paper, one can hear a lot of webinars or talks where indeed people like to grill the Commission. And yet the Commission keeps on taking initiatives. One remarkable one, for instance, is the adoption on the 16th of April of a series of guidelines on the implementation of EU provisions in the area of asylum, return and resettlement. The purpose of these guidelines, I quote, is to ensure the continuity of procedures while fully ensuring the protection of people, health and fundamental rights in line with the Charter. This being said, Henrik, we really would appreciate your contribution to this exchange this afternoon. How does the institution see its role in safeguarding the rights of migrants while implementing the EU agenda as it has been adopted by the institutions until now? The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jean-Louis, and it's a pleasure to take part in this webinar on this, as always, a very topical issues. Perhaps I start by picking up on what you said in the introduction on the guidance that we published in April, and to give you a little bit of background and content on that. I think we saw very quickly when the COVID crisis hit us, and which, as you all remember, happened very quickly, a number of developments that were of concern, one being that the number of asylum applications in all member states dropped dramatically to basically an all-time low. Secondly, that we looked, of course, at our own rules, our own acquis, and I noted that basically we have no particular exceptions or rules foreseen for this kind of situation. This had never been considered as a plausible scenario before, as you well know. And thirdly, just asking ourselves the very tricky question, how can you actually keep asylum systems running in a way that complies fully with the health and safety restrictions, so safeguarding the health both of the applicants but also of the staff of the member states authorities, while at the same time ensuring the access to the asylum procedure and kind of keeping this core function of the state running also in these difficult times. Also bearing in mind that an asylum system is something that in a way is dependent on face-to-face contact, whether it's when you register applicants, whether it's when you take care of them in the reception center, or whether you do the interviews to assess their applications. All that is by nature face-to-face activities. So in the guidance that, as you mentioned, were adopted by the Commission on the 16th of April, we tried, first of all, to establish the basic principles that indeed restrictions can and must be taken also with regard to the asylum process by member states, but any such restrictions must be proportional. They must be, above all, non-discriminatory, so not to single out asylum seekers or migrants for different treatment than others. And at all times, the principle of non-refoulement must be respected, also in these difficult times. On the content of the guidance, I would flag perhaps three things. One is that we did have a kind of a creative interpretation of our acquis, which, as you may know, contains certain exceptions and flexibility for member states when they are faced with a large number of applicants, the kind of sudden peak or inflow. And we consider that actually those exceptions could be seen as applicable also in the current pandemic situation. So in that sense, giving member states more flexibility when it comes to complying with the deadlines and other things like that. Secondly, we try to work into the guidance a lot of useful input we got from EASO, just in terms of very practical issues, kind of best practices that we could already see then emerging from the member states. So how do you do all these things in COVID times? How do you ensure the social distancing in reception centers? How do you replace the face-to-face interviews with remote interviewing? How do you ensure that you continue with the Eurodac registration and things like that? So there we try to be as practical as possible, and also to note that in parallel, EASO has published more detailed guidance on some of these specific issues. Also in that regard, to note that we did observe also a number of very good practices from the member states who, out of their own initiative, for example, prolonged the validity of residence permits or the right to stay in reception centers for asylum seekers as long as the current restrictions were in place. Third point of the guidance, which was the most tricky in a way, with relation to Dublin. So Dublin is always a reliable source for complications, also in these circumstances. So we basically observed that practically all member states stopped with their Dublin transfers, either due to an explicit decision or, let's say, as an implicit result of that travel was restricted to such an extent and airports more or less shut down that no transfers could in any case be carried out. Now, this leads to that, without going into the details too much, that whenever a transfer has not been carried out within 6 months, the responsibility for the asylum applicant in question will shift under the current Dublin rules. So a member state who wishes to transfer someone who does not succeed to do that within 6 months will have to take over and remain responsible for that applicant. And that, as you can imagine, gave rise to some concern, to put it diplomatically, from a number of member states who argue that this is a case of force majeure and therefore the deadlines are not applicable or should be frozen, or you should have a kind of a stop the clock effect. But in our assessment, we don't see that as possible in doing under the current Dublin regulation. Force majeure is a recognized principle in EU law and it can be applicable, but it depends on the particular legal framework you're looking at. And with regard to Dublin, which in the end concerns individual rights, and where the individual has the right to go to court to challenge, for example, a transfer decision, we did not see how, if I put it in quotes, we could invent a force majeure exception to the Dublin rules. There is no particular interpretation, let's say, of Dublin in that sense in the current times. That was, in a nutshell, I would say, that the main content of the guidance. As mentioned, EASO has been following up with the practical guidance on specific issues, and also helped us to monitor the situation. So coming back to that, we have seen for the last 4 weeks the number of asylum applications rising again, basically in parallel with as states gradually lift the confinement measures. Numbers are always difficult to compare, but still, to give you an idea, in the first 5 months of this year, we had 173,000 applications in the member states as a whole. Compared to the same period in 2019, we had 278,000. So it's a pretty big difference, but again, that difference is not necessarily fully explainable by the COVID effect. There can be, as always, many reasons behind that. We are also seeing now member states gradually resuming something close to the full activity of their asylum services. Actually, EASO published just earlier this week on the 2nd of June a very interesting report, which is publicly available, I think, on their website, to describing where member states are and the most recent measures they have taken. Also interesting from that report, EASO suggesting, which I think is correct, that probably the lessons learned from this COVID crisis will also be something positive in terms of improving the work of the asylum services in the future on a more permanent basis. I think lessons learned have been drawn on how to improve information provisions, how to use more e-services and e-tools in terms of making the process more efficient, and also to make authorities more accessible through e-tools for the applicants themselves. So there is also a positive twist to that. You mentioned in the beginning also, Jean-Louis, that the COVID crisis tend to reinforce already existing problems. I'm afraid I could somehow share that when we look at the issue of relocation, which has always been a struggle, which is a good example of what you said, with the Commission perhaps being the scapegoat, but in the current legal framework, we are entirely dependent on member states' voluntary pledging for relocation. So the relocation from the central Mediterranean, from Malta and Italy, have been difficult over the last months. Again, as the COVID crisis as an additional complication. We have managed, and we are very happy with that, to at least start the pilot project on the relocation of unaccompanied minors from Greece, where we had a decent number of pledges for a total of 1,600 minors to be relocated. So at least the first few of those have already been relocated, so the pilot has started. But again, it's struggling a little bit to keep up speed. That is, to be honest, not to entirely put the blame on the member states. You will all remember, of course, when we were in the middle of the confinement, the basic principle was that nobody should move anywhere. None of us was basically allowed to go further than to the nearest supermarket. So in that kind of circumstances, to organize and to set in motion large-scale relocation of people between member states is by default difficult, that's for sure. But what is important now is, of course, as we gradually get back to normal, and fingers crossed that there is not a second wave, that we also get back to normal on the side of relocation, at least as it was before COVID, and that we can come back to our reform agenda and put in place a new system that will organize solidarity in a good way between all the member states and address also a number of the other outstanding issues we have. But I think I stop there for the moment, but I'm of course happy to take questions, comments on any of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henrik. And indeed, I mean, these, well, back to normal will also be subject to many questions and I'm sure debate. I'm turning now to Michele LeVoy. Michele, I mean, Madam Arena in her introduction referred to, I mean, the even more problematic situation of migrants in an irregular situation. So you are the director of PICUM, a platform which really gives a voice to the voiceless. And I mean, you are well known amongst the people dealing with migration as the person who really embodies the situation and advocates permanently about the situation of those who are below the radar screen in a way. And which are even more vulnerable in present situation. So again, Michele, we are very happy to have you with us this afternoon. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jean-Louis, and thanks also to both the EPC and Egmont for organizing this. It's very helpful to have this focus. And it's very interesting to also hear Marie-Arena and Henrik Nielsen's interventions as well. And I wanted to start off with also briefly kind of recapping what you also mentioned in your intro, Jean-Louis, about how we see the particular impact of COVID on undocumented. And in a sense, what we see is precisely what you described. So an increase in suffering and stigmatization and problems of people who throughout the year in non-COVID times already face these issues. So what we've been hearing from our members is that many undocumented workers have either lost their income because they've lost their jobs during lockdowns, or they've continued to work in very precarious situations. So when they've lost their income, this also translates to their children. And we have heard from many of our members that undocumented people, families, are going hungry. And many of our organizations which work on specific issues, such as how to help workers file complaints against their employers, are faced with very basic questions on how can parents feed their children. And this is also because undocumented are systematically excluded from any of the employment benefits or stimulus packages that any country has been developing in COVID in the EU and globally. There's one exception, there's a couple of exceptions, I'll come to that later. And also when they have been working, in a sense, they're continued to be called essential workers because they're doing work in agriculture, food delivery, domestic work, cleaning. And yet when we did a word cloud with our members online a couple of weeks ago, and we asked them to give a keyword for what they were experiencing on the issue of labor during lockdowns, the top keyword was exploitation. So even during lockdowns, exploitation continues to be a reality. Marie-Arena also mentioned in the beginning that throughout the year, undocumented have very limited access to non-emergency healthcare. So throughout the year, this is difficult. And yet we know that the way to treat the pandemic is to have access to healthcare. And then finally, in terms of this general panorama, the UN Population Fund has indicated that there's been a 20% increase in gender-based violence in the 193 UN member states. Yet throughout the year, undocumented women fear that they could be deported if they go to the police station to report it, or even go to a women's shelter. So what I wanted to briefly mention here is we've been doing some research to see what are member states and other actors saying and doing in terms of responses during the lockdowns especially. How does this impact on undocumented, and how do we see all this going forward? And I would say there's 4 groupings that I wanted to mention. The first one is member states who have been releasing people from immigration detention. We've heard in the past couple months many NGOs, the Council of Europe, UN bodies, all calling for the release of migrants in detention. One, for the obvious reason of health reasons. It's a big risk for the people concerned, as well as the staff in the detention centers. But also the European Court of Justice and international human rights laws say that when there is no prospect of removal, detention is unlawful. And during lockdowns, in a sense, there was no prospect of real removal. So we've seen that hundreds of people were released in the UK, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, and Italy during lockdowns. In Spain, also, basically almost all people were released from immigration detention and provided in state-funded receptions programs. So obviously, while these are very positive signs, we also have to see how they were released. The Spanish example is very interesting because there was a big partnership between some of the key organizations that already had centers and places set up before the crisis where they could move people into. But in Belgium and the UK, a number of NGOs said that migrants were left destitute and homeless because they were not placed in any places when they were released. And we know that there are estimates and data that show that more than 100,000 people are detained each year across the European Union. So we need to find solutions for this beyond lockdown. It's an urgent issue. And what we are looking at are alternatives to detention. There's a study by EPIM that shows that in 3 pilot projects that were run between 2017 and 2019 in Bulgaria, Cyprus, and Poland, 97% of the participants in those projects remained engaged or achieved case resolution. So alternatives to detention is really trying to find a way to have people in the community and to work on case resolution. It's obviously much cheaper than detaining, and it's more effective. So this is one set of measures. The second one is extension of residence permits and suspension of forced returns. This actually shows a huge panorama of states who have done things. So we've noted 7 EU member states who automatically extended the validity of all the residence permits during the lockdown: Greece, Ireland, Italy, France, Luxembourg, Poland, and Slovakia. And also in Slovenia, migrants in return procedures were released and granted a temporary permit for up to 6 months. In 10 member states, forced returns were suspended or significantly reduced during lockdowns: Belgium, Bulgaria, Croatia, Cyprus, Czech Republic, Estonia, Lithuania, Malta, and Slovakia. I think we all have seen that we all will be living with this virus for another year, another 2 years. And it's been interesting to also see this recent paper from the UNHCR and IOM on COVID-19 and mixed movements. These 2 UN agencies say, quote, "Forced returns cannot be the only solution." And they also acknowledge the vital role that migrant workers play in some sectors. They actually call on the EU to, quote, "fundamentally change its approach to migration and labor mobility, and the EU should make a serious effort to regularize those whose contribution to the economic recovery will be essential." Something similar was said by the LIBE committee in the parliament in April, which called on the Commission to recognize that safe and regular migration is much broader than just asylum, and that we have to have safe legal routes for labor-related migration. So in this set of recommendations, we should really look going forward at undocumented having access to residence permits and status-determined procedures, and based on what member states are already doing. In the third set of measures, this is regularization. And I think here, obviously, the main one is Italy with its new regularization program, which could regularize up to 480,000 agricultural domestic workers and carers. interesting that it's part of this whole stimulus package that Italy has adopted of 55 billion euros to help relaunch the Italian economy. And obviously there are criteria. No regularization is actually ever done these days without specific criteria. So the worker has to have been in Italy before the 8th of March, the start of the lockdown. People who were had in a residence permit who expired after the 31st of October last year could also apply. And employers apply on behalf of the workers. And the workers could get a 6 months temporary permit. The critics of this regularization program say that it's focused too much on the employer, and it's also focused too much on the need for the additional workforce. However, it's interesting to see how regularization is picking up. So Belgium civil society advocates have said that the government's strategy to combat corona is no strategy if it leaves out undocumented. In Spain, there's a really powerful campaign with 200 NGOs taking part. 41,000 people have signed a petition for regularization. In France, 20 members of parliament have called for regularization, and now a new campaign with 210 NGOs and migrant-led organizations that have signed on. And also the city level is also vocal now. Barcelona and Mons in Belgium have both asked their governments on the national level to tackle residence permits. So I think with regularization, even though France had proposed a ban on regularizations when it held the presidency in 2008, I think it's also interesting to recall all this. Regularization is definitely not taboo. And the regime project from 2009 identified 24 out of the 27 EU member states that had regularization programs or mechanisms between 1996 and 2008. During that period, between 5.5 to 6 million people were regularized. And I think just here, it's also interesting to go back to what you had mentioned at the beginning of the guidance from the Commission from the 16th of April. And the Commission underlined in that guidance, quote, member states enjoy broad discretion to grant a residence permit or another authorization offering a right to stay to irregular migrants for compassionate, humanitarian, or other reasons, as provided for the Return Directive. So we do have the initiative also from the European Commission. And I would just say very briefly on the regularization schemes and programs. PICUM did some research a couple years ago and we came up with recommendations around these. They shouldn't be too expensive. The criteria should be clear for people applying. Dependency on the employer can lead to exploitation, so not having this dependency is preferable. There should be a temporary status to access services. There should be free legal aid, a right to appeal, and the permit should be secure as long-term as possible. So there are recommendations when we look at this. And I'll just finish with the last point, which is social protection measures. Here, we don't have as many examples as those other categories that I was talking about. The only one that there's two that I would mention. The first one is Ireland. So in Ireland during the pandemic, undocumented migrants are able to get full access to social welfare and healthcare. And authorities confirmed that there would be a firewall. So there would be no data sharing between service providers and immigration officers so that they can get that access to healthcare. What is also extremely interesting with Ireland is it's the only country that we've seen mapping countries in Europe and also the United States and maybe some other ones that have enabled undocumented to be eligible for the pandemic payment. So all these initiatives that countries are doing, the stimulus packages, Ireland allows undocumented to get access to this. Portugal obviously had this government order from the 27th of March, which granted access to healthcare, welfare provisions, and the labor market to people who had applied for a residence, asylum, or work permit before the 18th of March. So obviously this example, the Portuguese, is actually at the heart of all the calls for regularization that I mentioned previously. We do also see, though, that NGOs such as SOS Racismo has estimated that roughly 20,000 to 30,000 people obviously could be reached by the order, which is very promising. but that potentially 80,000 to 100,000 migrants could be excluded. And this would involve sub-Saharan workers, for example, who did not have an ongoing residence procedure, who had not been able to apply in the first place. And this procedure will finish by the 1st of July. So we have to see what will happen afterwards. And just to conclude, I would say that while we're looking now, the word of the day is no longer really lockdown, it's recovery. How do we get out of this? How do we get out of confinement? How do we go into recovery plans? We have to consider who are vulnerable, as was rightly said in the beginning, and make sure they're not left out again. So how should this be done? By facilitating access to services, making it easy for people to actually get services like healthcare if they need to, doing direct outreach to migrant communities with NGOs and others who are trusted partners, making sure there's firewalls so the people who want to get access to healthcare or want to go file a complaint to the police or for other reasons can do so without feeling that their data will be shared. And here I think it's good to also reaffirm Europe's own commitment to social inclusion and to fostering inclusive societies where community well-being, safety, health, workers' rights and justice are prioritized over narrow immigration enforcement concerns. And finally, funding. This was mentioned already by Marie-Arena, the MFF. Poverty eradication should be at the heart of any financial response to COVID-19. We know that increased social spending can help mitigate some of the effects of the economic downturns, and we should ensure that any funding going forward it really focused on those who might suffer the most from the current pandemic, including undocumented children and their parents. They shouldn't be left behind again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michele, and thank you to all the panelists, I have to say. I have on my screen a few questions. Some of them are very specific, and Michele, I can already inform you that many people are asking to get links or indication about the sources that you quote, decisions of the Court of Justice, studies, report. So we'll turn back to you afterwards and we'll provide them via the EPC website. I can reassure those who are looking for this information. There are questions around what Marie-Arena rightly called earlier the new migration narrative. I mean, I will in a way paraphrase a question I have in front of me, and it can be taken by all kinds of panelists. I mean, the pandemics that we know today is unique in a way in a history, because it's the first time ever that we have a global humanitarian situation, not only in third countries but also inside Europe. Is this susceptible to facilitate the development of this new positive narrative about migration and mobility that Marie-Arena was advocating for? Because one could also play devil's advocate, for instance, Michele, following what you said about regularization. Yes, many of us have the feeling that the debate about regularization is not taboo anymore, but isn't it easier to sell regularization nowadays to public opinion, where travel are difficult, borders are closed? That is to say, it's about those who are already there, and that therefore you cannot use the argument, the classical argument that can be questioned, of the so-called pull factor, of course. Because, I mean, you remember, you rightly referred to this ban on regularization that was imposed on the EU by France at the time of the 2008 presidency. But the argument used was the fear of this kind of pull factor that regularization could constitute. So, I mean, about the possibility to have this change of narrative, and maybe Henrik, you would like also to say something about that, again, with reference to this, pact which remains, which is still one of the key priorities of the Commission chaired by Madame von der Leyen. I don't know who wants to take this question, this question. Madame Arena, maybe?
Yeah. Yes? Okay. In fact, we don't know exactly if it will change positively the narrative or not, but I think that there are some arguments to say that protecting a few is not giving the possibility to succeed, to protect everybody, to give the opportunity to be protected. And we have seen that for the coronavirus, we have seen a lot of people having more solidarity, more responsibility for others, because they know that it is with this solidarity, with this responsibility, that we can protect each other. So it could be a way of saying there is no use to protect yourself if you are not protecting the more vulnerable people. And so, yes, we can go in this narrative to protect more vulnerable people. And we have to use it like this. But if you just let some politicians saying that you have to fear them and to put them in camps or to send them away of Europe because they are a risk for the population, they can win this narrative also. So we need all the democratic forces from the right to the left to say that we can win if we are together. If we are just trying to protect ourselves against the other, it won't succeed. So this is really important to give this narrative. The second thing, it is also important to have it's why I talk about the MFF and the recovery plan. It is important to have the more robust social security plan in each country, to give the possibility to each country to answer to the population. If the population feel that there is a choice between them and the other, this will be a problem. So we have to support this recovery plan for a lot of people and working against poverty on this, and to show that it is possible to take into account even people being in Europe and not being regularisé. I don't know how to say that. So it's important to have this robust capacity to have everybody in our social security plan. If you give the population the feeling that we have to choose between the European one and the other, it will be a disaster.
Thank you. Does anybody want to follow on or comment on this? Yes, Michele. And Henrik, if you wish to chip in, please let me know. Michele.
Yeah, thank you. I think the narrative question is really the one that we've had before the pandemic, and one that we're going to have for years to come. I thought it was really interesting, Marie, when you were saying in your presentation about the failures actually of the current migration policy. We still have children who are detained. The EU law allows it. Exactly. This is also a narrative question. Why is it possible to actually still detain children for immigration reasons if all these UN bodies in the past 5 to 7 years, Council of Europe, we have so many ample recommendations that detaining children for immigration reasons is always a child rights violation. It's never in their best interest. We have very clear indications coming from different levels. And this narrative continues, that it's still feasible and possible to detain children. So we definitely urgently need to look at this and how narrative is not just word change, but how it translates obviously into policy change. And one of the other things I also thought that was very interesting in your presentation, Marie, where you mentioned this holistic approach. We don't think that it's possible to change the narrative by looking at migration policy alone. We have to look at other policy areas in the EU where migrants should be part of that, where they should be mainstreamed. So for example, the gender strategy that the EU has just adopted needs to look at the particular vulnerabilities of migrant women concerning gender-based violence, concerning access to healthcare, concerning the labor market. It needs to show migrant women as part of its key areas of work in its strategy. The upcoming child rights strategy that will be adopted next year, the same thing. Migrant children have to be a key part of that in the child rights strategy. And children have to be a part of the upcoming Pact of Migration, not just looking at the very acute situations of unaccompanied children who need to be relocated, but all children in migration. The victims' rights strategy that the EU will most likely launch this month needs to look at the vulnerable people who are not in practice covered by the Victims Directive. So the Victims Directive in Article 1 says it's applicable to all regardless of residence status. In practice, undocumented people cannot go to the police or get all the other services that the directive talks about. And also, Marie mentioned people who are criminalized for providing assistance or humanitarian assistance to people who are in an irregular status. This is a human rights defender's approach, but unfortunately, the EU probably has a well-developed human rights defenders approach as long as it's outside the EU, but when it's inside the EU, this is also a big challenge. So we would also say that in order to also help all of us change this narrative, we need to also work more systematically with other partners beyond the pure migration policy domain. And migrants have to be part of those other strategies and processes. And I think it would be good to see going forward how to strengthen this even amongst the Commission itself and also amongst the relevant committees in the Parliament.
Thank you very much. I have someone asking the floor. I mean, Melissa Julian, are you with us?
Yes, hello. Thank you very much. My name is Melissa Julian. I'm from the IOM's EU office. I just wanted to raise the issue about the horrible things that are related to COVID-19. On one side, though, there is a good, well, not a good thing, but I mean, a window of an opportunity, a once in a lifetime opportunity, I think, that we could seize, because every person in Europe now feels a profound and a personal vulnerability to a global crisis. Every single person has been witness to what the crisis does, that is not distinguished, it doesn't distinguish between nationalities or borders or languages, cultures, statuses. And every person has been acting together also to protect everyone, with a few unfortunate exceptions. And many societies have also realized how dependent they are on migrants, as we've all been saying, in some of these, the frontline areas that we're working on. And so at this moment, strategic proposals from the EU institutions, whether it's Marie and the Parliament or the other EU institutions and the EU member states governments, proposals on policies to address global issues, which includes migration, in an evidence-based way and in a comprehensive way, is going to resonate now with people like it never has before. That's what, for me, seems new now. We've been trying to change narratives, as you say, for the last 10 years, but now it will resonate like never before. So if we can seize that opportunity as international organizations, as NGOs, again, all working together to remind the citizens of our European countries that the key role that migrants have played so far. Here in Belgium, we have the sheets hanging out the window, for the nurses, etc. Having people realize that sheet represents also the migrants who have been working in the front line, in the shops, in the hospitals, etc. And how we've depended on them during the crisis. So continuing, we at IOM have been sharing those messages nonstop from all over the world. So that is resonating with people. I mean, the work that we've seen so far is that people are quite open to this now. But then also carrying on with that to be able to say that they are going to be vital to Europe's recovery as well. And again, not us versus them anymore, but all of us are facing the same challenge. The recovery is going to be hard. The recession is going to be hard, job losses, etc. So we need to look at how we can all help each other together and how migrants can be a key contributor to coming out of the recovery. So I just wanted to know if Marie agrees with that, if that's something that the Parliament would be pushing. Also, Michele, I would love if you think that that's also the kind of way we should be moving now, and if it's opportune. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I have the feeling. Sorry, I have the feeling that it resonates exactly what Maria Rena said about. I mean, this social protection, which should be extended to everybody and would not play one social category against the other. But I can give her back the floor, please, Maria Rena.
Yeah, of course, I totally agree, and we have to take this opportunity to work on this more progressive agenda for the future of Europe. So, of course, it is. And it's what I said, if we are just taking the future as we have done in the past, not only for migration, but in general, it will be a problem for Europe. So we have to take this opportunity to change the way we are dealing with social protection in Europe and fighting against inequality. So for me, it's really important to do it in this way. I don't know exactly if in the, we are working for the moment in the recovery plan. We in the European Parliament, we ask in the recovery plan to be really sure that this money is addressed to people living in a very, very vulnerable situation. And for us, migrant people are in this category of people. So, but this is the position of the Parliament. Now you know that between the Commission position that is more oriented to economy recovery and the position of the Council, and we don't know now the position of the Council, and you know that some countries are reluctant to any kind of solidarity, even between European one, and without speaking about migrants, it will be a very difficult discussion in the Council, but we will see what will be the result in the Council. And with this result, everybody knows that it is the Parliament that has the last vote for the recovery plan also. But all these plans they have to be ratified in the national Parliament. So, if this recovery plan said textually that it is meant to deal with migration and it has to go to the Hungarian Parliament, it will be a problem. So we have to be more clever and to speak about fighting against poverty for all the vulnerable people in Europe being here on the territory, not speaking about the status of these people, and trying to have the consent of all the European Parliament to have this agreement. And this will be the challenge. And it is why we need also to work with NGOs, because you don't change the narrative just with political people. We need to have more and more people on the ground and speaking about this situation and this terrible situation that migrants are living all over the Europe. So it's necessary to work together on this.
Thank you very much. I have a series of questions now. Some of them are very specific, and we might send them to the participants of the panel so that they could answer this question in writing. There are also a few questions about the free circulation inside the Schengen area. There, I would say, well, one can see a link with the issue that we are discussing this afternoon, because of course there is a danger there also, is that, okay, control has been reinstated at borders, including internal borders, and people felt comfortable, they felt protected by these controls. And the Commission was clever enough to organize this green corridor, which allowed the goods to keep on flowing and the internal market not to be at stake, to be at risk. And of course, one can draw the conclusion that after all, one can have something like the free circulation of goods with restrictions and permanent restrictions on the movement of individuals. I mean, that can come to the mind of some, and we have already heard, I mean, politicians, to quote you, Maria Rena, using this kind of argument, and I would say, to put it mildly, asking for prudence in the re-establishment of a full area, an area of fully free circulation, not only for EU citizens, but also for third country nationals residing legally inside the Schengen zone. That is, maybe we are not there yet. I mean, Henrik, Nielsen, I mean, you've been with us. I mean, do you think that there is indeed this window of opportunity and that the Commission could use it to come with, I would say, maybe not a drastically new approach, but I mean, certainly an approach which could contribute changing the narrative that has been widely advocated by not only the participants to the panel, but also those attending to the questions that they are putting to us now. Henrik, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think I was thinking of that, and indeed, it's certainly been a clear objective of our Commissioner, Madam Johansson, since he took office to indeed move to a more positive narrative. I put it in my own words, not as well as she can, but I think she's very keen in particular to get out of this association between migration and crisis, but rather to make clear and to move to a narrative where, you know, migration is something normal. It's normal having to manage it, and we can do that in normal times without having to switch on the crisis button as soon as some number increases by 43.5% or something like that. And I think that commitment is still there, and it's very strong with the college as a whole to do what we can to move in that direction. Now, will the COVID make that more easy or more difficult? That's a bit the million-dollar question. I think it's really important, and I think we will try to do that, to pick up on the many positive examples that have been mentioned also in this debate, and which have lifted forward the vital contributions that migrants do make to our society. And we can use that as a way to further reinforce the need for the more positive narrative. That, I think, is really a key element. A second key element, you just mentioned it, in fact, Jean-Louis, I think it's really important indeed that we move back to Schengen as well as we can, and that indeed the COVID does not turn out to be an excuse to delay back to Schengen. And that's something to keep a careful eye on, I would say, in the next 1 to 2 months, which I think will be quite crucial in that regard. Then there is, of course, the more global question, which I just ask myself, and I certainly don't claim to have an answer, but what will happen to global mobility in this new normal in the short to medium term perspective, meaning 1 to 2 years? Will the number of people traveling, the number of people coming to Europe for a short stay with a valid visa, will that now be permanently down, or will we somehow get back to the very high levels of travel that we had before COVID? And I think there is a strong link between that kind of normal mobility and with migration. So as maybe a last point, if I would end on an optimistic note, one could hope, of course, that member states see that indeed with existing or pre-existing problems to some extent being made worse by COVID, and I took relocation as an example, it further emphasizes the need for a thorough migration reform. So the willingness to get that reform through would then be higher. But nevertheless, whether it leads to more flexibility and readiness to compromise on the side of the member states, I would not dare to speculate in, I'm afraid.
That is going to be the problem, of course, because there is this deliberation of the European Council, which in a way shot itself in the foot by stating that all these issues should be adopted by consensus, notwithstanding the fact that it is clearly, ordinary legislation and co-decision and qualified majority. So that will, I will come back to what Maria said about the position of some difficult member states. They can block any endeavor, even if the Commission, which we all hope, comes with a very forthcoming paper, as she did in the beginning of its mandate with the New European Green Deal, and as she did on the 27th of May when proposing its recovery plan, which was really seen as a major step forward by many observers. But once the initiative is taken, as we said, the jury is out, and we know how difficult the jury can be, at least certainly within the Council for the time being. Now, I think that we are slowly but reaching the moment where, Olivia, we are going to pass you the floor You've been taking a lot of notes. You've been listening very carefully to this exchange. What kind of concluding remark would you share with us?
Thank you very much, Jean-Louis, for the floor, and thank you all for excellent and presentations and an extremely rich discussion, I would say. I'll summarize perhaps into 3 key insights that I think have been discussed. First and foremost, I think all of our speakers today have done an excellent job in shedding a light on the full extent of the impact that COVID-19 has had on undocumented migrants and all other migrants, in fact, within the EU and its borders, and the way in which it has exacerbated pre-existing vulnerabilities. Some of the issues that we have discussed were the lack of access to healthcare, the lack of NGO access to camps, and the situations that were most vulnerable and most at need, the loss of livelihoods, the risk of exploitation, the further undermining of search and rescue, and all of these impacts, of course, will continue to be felt for long after the COVID-19 pandemic. I think it was particularly interesting that we focus so much on the narratives around migration. And I think given the fact that this event takes place at a time when discrimination, racism, and xenophobia is very high on the agenda at a global level, I think it's extremely important that we also give this a lot of focus in Europe as well. And I think the future of narratives and xenophobia on migration will continue to require a lot of attention in the coming months. The second point that I think was a key point in the discussion are, however, the signs of hope that we have seen in how member states have responded to the pandemic. On one hand, the European Commission, but also member states, the European Parliament, civil society, and many other EU agencies deserve certainly a lot of recognition for the way that they have responded to this unprecedented emergency to try to uphold a common European asylum system, to try to uphold the right to asylum and migrant health. And I think that within this, we've seen a lot of very positive signs that our speakers outlined in quite a lot of detail. These range from regularisation measures to releases from detention, to expanded access to social welfare, to more positive narratives around migration, and to an extension of the right to stay. It is, of course, worth noting that these measures have had wide discrepancies in how they've been implemented by member states. Some of member states have reduced detention while others have increased it. Their implementation of these positive measures has been uneven and sometimes unharmonized. And of course, they haven't always been unproblematic, as was rightly pointed out, in terms of the focus of regularisation measures, in terms of the people that have been excluded from access to social welfare, or in terms of what happened to people that were released from detention without suitable accommodation. So I think it's extremely valuable of our speakers to have highlighted these positive messages and the challenges they still face. But I certainly think that, to borrow a phrase from the audience, it has opened a window of opportunity to really consider policies that were not on the table before, and to really reflect on what kind of common European asylum system we want to have. Which brings us to a third and last question, and perhaps the most important, which is what happens now? Because I think this event comes at a very critical time for both the future of the SEAS and for the future of social security plans. All eyes now are on the upcoming new pact, which we're expecting the Commission to put forward in the coming weeks or months. All eyes are on the new German presidency of the Council, which will take over in less than a month, on the new discussions for the MFF, on the recovery plan, and of course, on the potential for a second wave of COVID-19. So in light of all of these challenges, and this very timely and momentous moment for the Commission and the EU as a whole, I think it's extremely valuable that all of our speakers have issued so many actionable and thoughtful recommendations on how to translate all of these insights and all of these challenges we've seen in the pandemic to a more permanent reform of the common European asylum system that makes it more sustainable and that makes it more resilient. To perhaps bring it back to the introduction, if indeed this pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing vulnerabilities, the question now should be, how do we tackle those pre-existing vulnerabilities in the long term? And how do we create a system that doesn't leave the most vulnerable behind? So I think our speakers have done an excellent job in summarizing a very complex and very rapidly moving discussion in these last few minutes. And maybe as a final note, I think indeed in the coming months, something that we'll have to pay very close attention to in the discussions of the new pact will be this issue of relocations, because I think that is, as Henrik Nielsen rightly pointed out, one of the most controversial and one of the most complex elements of the SEAS as we stand, and one of the elements that has perhaps most exacerbated how people have suffered from COVID-19 in certain countries like Greece or like Malta compared to others. Just this morning, it may be worth noting that Michael Klaus, the German permanent representative at the EU, told the EPC that he cannot envision a solution to the migration file that does not at some point include mandatory relocations. So bearing this in mind and bearing, of course, the proposal remains to be seen, and this is a very controversial file, but I think it's certainly something that will merit very close attention, a lot of hard work from the Commission, a lot of hard work from the Parliament, and of course a lot of hard work from Member States. So we will all be keeping an eye on that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivia. I try to discipline myself and switch out my mic, but it's always a problem because I forgot that I had switched out my mic. Okay, so I mean, the time has come not only to thank you, Olivia, for your very brilliant conclusion, but also to thank our three main panelists for the time they spent this afternoon with us. You said it yourself. I mean, they provided real thorough insights, including recommendations, and those of us who have been listening to this may bring that back with them. It was we certainly an added value and more thought about what needs to be done or what could be done, not only in terms of advocacy, because advocacy is important, but it might sound easy, but also in terms of action to be taken or action that should be promoted. I come back to my initial point about the scenarios. So this is not a forecast. I mean, these are just scenario, but we can work to make them possible and to give them more credibility by showing that, yes, it is possible, yes, we can do it, and we can do it by taking that action or implementing that measure. And for that, I think that we have to be extremely grateful to our three main panelists this afternoon. I can reassure the participant, I mean, this, as all webinars convened by EPC, is recorded, and the recording of the webinar will be available. If you missed something, you will be able to come back on what was said this afternoon, and we'll provide a couple of more specific questions to individual panelists as I promised earlier, so that you can get the information for them that you were requesting to. Last but not least, I mean, EPC and Egmont will not leave you off the hook with regards to migration and migration-related subject. On the 19th, there is a rendezvous. That's a World Refugee Day, by the way, 19th of June. There is a rendezvous with another EPC webinar with two distinguished guests, Vincent Costel from HCR and Ola Henriksson from IOM, on, guess what, the impact of COVID-19, but this time on mixed migration movement. I know the study which is at the basis of this webinar, and it's really worth listening to. What is worth listening to will be also another webinar convened on the 23rd of June by Egmont. We do a lot of things together, but sometimes we do things separately. This 23rd of June webinar will be dedicated to the global compact on migration, how it was negotiated, and how it could serve the purpose of providing a global framework for a global approach of migration and mobility in a post-COVID phase. The three main speakers there will be Jean-Luc Botson, the Belgian's Ambassador Special Envoy for Migration and Asylum, Ola Henriksson again, who is definitely very much solicited, and Rainer Munz, who used to work in the forward-looking study cell of the Commission, and is now attached to the Joint Research Center in ISPRA. So again, thank you very much for having attended this afternoon webinar. Thank you very much to the wonderful team of EPC of having supported this seminar. We wish you all, I mean, we are mainly there, a good weekend, a good deconfinement, because most of our countries are now moving to somewhat more freedom. We'll see, and we're crossing fingers that we hope that there will be no second wave. And also, I think that all of us, panelists and participants, will watch very carefully what's going to happen during the weeks and the months to come along the lines suggested by Olivia in her concluding remark. Take care and good afternoon to everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.